Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Plummer. This episode starts a new series of the podcast that won't have any particular guiding theme, but instead looks at various topics that scholars are working on.
In this episode, we talk with Nathan Bray and Stephen Kershnar about whether God is morally responsible.
Enjoy.
I'm happy to introduce two guests to the show today, Nathan Bray and Stephen Kershnar. Nathan's a PhD student in philosophy at the University of St. Andrews, and Stephen is Distinguished Teaching Professor of Philosophy at Fredonia State University of New York. Stephen and Nathan have published one paper together, which is on the topic of cultural appropriation, but they're currently working on a project on the issue of whether God can be morally responsible, and we've invited them to join us to talk about that topic today. Welcome to the show, Stephen and Nathan. Can you each start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Steve and I initially got interested in doing responsibility stuff with respect to God because Steve had written a book called Responsibility Collapses. I read that book. I thought it was fantastic. Everybody should go get a copy and read it for themselves. And then I thought to myself, well, how could we apply this to God? Because I was doing a lot of stuff in the philosophy of religion. So it was really a melding of our two disciplines, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And that melding then produced what we're working on right now, which is divine responsibility and whether God can be responsible. So yeah. Steve, any additions?
Yeah, and we were also interested not just in whether God is responsible, but how does that affect the case for or against God's existence? Mm-hmm. So kind of broader thing of does it matter whether or not God's responsible in terms of the arguments for his existence or in terms of understanding what it means to be the greatest possible being?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You've argued for the thesis that God is not responsible. And we want to dig into the argument for that thesis. But first, could you say a bit about some of the key concepts that will be used in your argument and any assumptions that you're making?
Sure. So by responsibility, we think that responsibility is a basic property. That is, it's not reducible. It's like the good or the right. We know what it is, but we can't further analyze it. We're going to treat praiseworthiness as positive responsibility. So if you think of responsibility on a continuum, praiseworthiness would be the positive part of the continuum. Blameworthiness would be the negative part of the continuum. And there's also a neutral part, which would be neither praiseworthy nor blameworthy. So that's how we think of it. And we think of God as the greatest possible being for two reasons. Number one, that's how we think that the ordinary person thinks of God. They might also think about God as the supreme being or the perfect being, but we think they all point to the same notion. And also we think that the best arguments for God's existence all depend to some degree on the modal ontological argument. And the modal ontological argument, we claim, assumes that God is the greatest possible being. So in short, we think responsibility is a basic, unanalyzable property, and we think God is the greatest possible being.
All right. Well, let's turn to the argument itself. How do you all argue for the claim that God's not morally responsible?
So we have two different arguments. I'll present the first one, and Nathan will present the second one. The first one is that God is not significantly responsible. And by significantly responsible, we mean that he's responsible for doing good and also for avoiding evil. We claim that God cannot be responsible for avoiding evil simply because he can't do evil and he knows that he can't do evil. So the argument is straightforward. So if God is the greatest possible being, then we think he's essentially omnibenevolent. That is, he's all good in every possible world. If he's essentially omnibenevolent, then every one of his attitudes is maximally good. So he has no evil attitudes. If he has no evil attitudes, then he can't be motivated to perform evil. If he can't be motivated to perform evil, then he can't decide to perform evil. If he can't decide to perform evil, he can't intend to perform evil. And if he can't intend to perform evil, then he can't do evil. So because God can't do evil, we claim that God is not responsible for avoiding evil. As a result, he's not significantly responsible.
Perfect. So yeah, then the second argument that we have is an argument from compulsion. The argument from compulsion, which is going to undermine insignificant responsibility of will, goes as follows. It's composed of two premises. The first of which is that God is compelled. The second is that if God is compelled, then he's not going to be responsible. And so therefore God's not responsible. So then the question is, why think that God is compelled? The reason to think that God is compelled is that he cannot help but perform a morally good action. And essentially what this comes down to is that his essential moral perfection overrides his decision-making procedure such that his choices become involuntary. We think that this is important because, people like John Searle, what they're going to know is that drug addicts, alcoholics, and other types of compulsives don't have psychological freedom. Given the psychological situation that they're in, they can't help themselves. And this notion of not being able to help yourself, not being able to zig or zag, being compelled to act in one way rather than another is responsibility undermining. And we think that that intuition carries over to the case of God. And if I could just quickly sketch this, there's a little bit of a four-case argument that I'm going to zip through. But the initial case is, think about a compulsive such as a kleptomaniac. Right? A kleptomaniac, we typically don't hold them responsible. This is in the SEP as well, people like David Robb. And the idea is that there is a compulsion that overrides the decision-making procedure such that their choices become involuntary. Now, what we suggest is that there's no distinction between a kleptomaniac and a kleptophobic, someone who wouldn't steal a candy bar in order to save a village, right? And if you think that there's no distinction between the kleptomaniac, who's engaging maybe in morally wrongful behavior, and the kleptophobic, who's engaging maybe in morally right behavior by not stealing, then there's no responsibility-related difference between the two. So the kleptophobic isn't responsible. What about the kleptocorrect? The kleptocorrect would be somebody who steals when and only when it's morally permissible to do so, but otherwise they have this compulsion, not to steal. All right, what about that case? That person doesn't seem to be responsible either, because it's the psychological configuring that seems to undermine the responsibility. Now take the kleptocorrect and then move to the divine kleptocorrect. Okay, the divine kleptocorrect is just the same as the kleptocorrect, except they're a divine being. And we say that that's very similar to God, okay? And we say that there's no responsibility-related difference between the four cases. So if you don't think that the kleptomaniac is responsible, then you shouldn't think that the divine kleptocorrect is responsible. And the divine kleptocorrect is similar to God. So we don't think that God is responsible. And this gets at the intuition that God is compelled. If God is compelled, then he's not responsible. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, so you consider several possible objections to your argument, and we want to ask you about a few of those now. First, someone might argue that God is morally responsible because he's the sole source of his actions. So could you explain this objection in more detail and tell us how you guys respond?
Oh, yeah. So the source incompatibilism objection is a very common one that we receive. Steve and I have been presenting these arguments to various philosophers. And what people often say is they say, well, look, God is the sole source of his thoughts and acts. If he's the sole source of his thoughts and acts, then he's responsible. Now, what we want to say here is manifold. The first response that we want to have is that even if a manipulated or instantly created being is the sole source of his acts, intuitively, he's not responsible. Now, why think this? Because the source really couldn't have done otherwise. The source was compelled in some meaningful sense to have performed that particular action. And if that's the case, then it's confusing to say why we would praise that person or why we would blame that person in any meaningful sense. The second response to this, I think that I'm going to hand over to Steve, and this relates to independence, right? So, yeah.
Yes. So the idea is that we're not sure that the source theory of responsibility really is an independent theory. We tend to think that, look, it either reduces to leeway incompatibilism, because if nothing, prevents you from doing thing or not doing something, then both are open to you. So it's a version of leeway, or it's a version of compatibilism. If all that matters is that it flows from your psychological state. But the basic view behind sources, even if the source theory of responsibility is true, it still doesn't make someone who's compelled not responsible. That is, a fully manipulated being is not responsible, regardless of whether or not source theory is correct.
That's interesting. So I have a lot of thoughts on that.
We're sure you do. We're sure you do.
But I'm trying to show some restraint. We'll see if I'm compelled or not to interject a little more.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
And the thing you just said, Stephen, about kind of thinking about a compatibilist view where, the action stems from the agent's psychological states in the right sort of way, leads into the next objection that we wanted to talk about, which is, maybe God actually satisfies compatibilist conditions on moral responsibility, even if he maybe can't do otherwise than the right thing. Maybe he still meets some maybe sourcehood compatibilist conditions on responsibility. Maybe he even meets other compatibilist conditions on responsibility. So could you say a bit more about that objection and how you all handle that one?
Okay, yeah, sure. That's really good. So we're going right down the list of the most common objections that Steve and I have received to this argument. So it's really wonderful that we're hearing these objections because we're well prepared.
All right.
So the first objection that I want to give, which is the one that I like doing, is a little bit of dialectical framing. So recall what the theistic worldview is here. So the theist is saying that there is a perfect being that freely chose to create the universe in some meaningful sense. You see this a little bit in the Kalam with William Lane Craig. Now, if we go compatibilist to a certain extent, it seems like we're walking back the notion that, God made this leeway choice, maybe in order to create the universe and whatnot. So there might be some costs associated with that the libertarian freedom that's used in natural theological arguments is going to have to be walked back a little bit. So that's a dialectical cost that I'm going to highlight. The second one that I want to highlight is an asymmetry. So recall how important libertarian freedom and that type of responsibility is for the theist. So the free will defense, the soul-making theodicy, all of these theodicies and responses to the problem of evil that rely on the notion of robust responsibility, significant responsibility, libertarian freedom. And now all of a sudden God doesn't have that. But it seems as though that was a great maker, or that was a really good thing for humans to have. So why is it a really good thing for humans to have, but it's not a really good thing for God to have? And now, because there is this gap, there's this mismatch, the theist has an additional thing that they need to explain, and the naturalist could find that a little bit odd or a little bit strange or a little bit unpersuasive. It seems slightly ad hoc. And so what I can do in order to respond to this, at least in part, is just raise the burden for the theist to adopt this particular view. So maybe I'll stop there, and then you could respond a little bit to that before we get into the compulsion stuff.
And I just want to quickly add one thing as well, which is the compulsion argument still stands. I mean, let's imagine you have John Martin Fisher's guide and control view of responsibility, which I think is the best theory out there. It's still the case that a compelled agent is not responsible. I mean, a fully manipulated Patty Hearst is not going to be responsible, even if she satisfies, whatever other conditions of guidance control are present. So long as God is compelled, even if compatibilism is true, and even if God meets the other conditions, he's not going to be responsible any more than a 100% manipulated Patty Hearst is going to be.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So one quick thought on that. It's at first I thought, well, in the case of God's nature, there's no external compulsion. There's no manipulator. I mean, he's not like the instant agents that people talk about in the literature, because he doesn't come into being created by a god or goddess or anything like that. But it seems like what you're interested in is, if we can call God's sort of psychological states the sort of parallel to a case of human compulsion, whether there's a manipulator or not. I guess, in the case of, Fisher and Revisa's account of reason's responsiveness, you can get someone who's not reason's responsive because they have a certain kind of compulsion. And the problem has to do with whether they're able to react to the right kinds of reasons that they recognize. It doesn't seem like you quite have that problem in the divine case, even if you don't have the ability to, if God doesn't have the ability to react to like bad moral reason or something like that, bad reason to do otherwise. So I guess maybe this is just an invitation to say a little bit more about how the compulsion in the divine case undermines responsibility. Is it a failure to be sensitive to reasons or to react to them? Or is it more about the fact that God hasn't sort of taken ownership of these psychological states, or maybe something else?
So I think it's neither. So take the case of, imagine the Symbionese Liberation Army 100% brainwashes Patty Hearst, but brainwashes in a way so that she's perfectly virtuous, right? So she's reasons responsive and she takes ownership. We still would think that Patty Hearst was not responsible just on the basis of intuitions, right? That's kind of a strong intuition. And so by analogy, the similarity between manipulation and God would be neither is responsible for his psychology, neither is responsible for the person authorizing a psychology, whether it's done through identification or through endorsement. Neither is responsible for the psychology producing his action. In God's case, if something other than his psychology produced his action, he would lose independence and hence lose a great maker. But if you're not responsible for your psychology, and you're not responsible for authorizing it, and you're not responsible for your psychology producing your action, then you're not responsible for your action. So I would say, I think you and I are probably both, giant fans of John Martin Fisher. Say that, God is going to be both reasonably responsive and have ownership, but he's going to be no more responsible than is a fully manipulated agent.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to like whether my intuitions are tracking the right thing, because I can't get over the fact that in the Patty Hearst case, what seems to be undermining is that there's an outside agent doing the manipulation. And so it's kind of hard to imagine a case, because an uncreated being like God, who has always had the psychological states that God has, is in a category of one. And it's kind of hard to trust that my intuitions are tracking the right thing. Does this make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. If I could take a stab at an answer here, I think that the intuition here is that, well, God was, not to say given his psychology, but it's impossible for him to have possessed an alternative psychology.
Yeah.
And to us, that seems to be the motivating factor behind it being responsibility undermining. When you look at compulsives, genuine compulsives, not the cases that might be subject to further empirical undermining, they couldn't have done otherwise in any meaningful sense, and we tend to not to hold them praiseworthy or blameworthy as a result. So Bennett 2016 has an article about this where he talks about a compelled benefactor, right? So let's imagine a case where there's somebody who is completely compelled to donate to Oxfam. Now, would we hold that person praiseworthy, or would we find that person praiseworthy for donating to Oxfam in any meaningful sense? It seems as though the answer is no. And why is that the case? Well, it seems that the person had a psychology that motivated them to do so in a way that was inexorable. Now, God, it seems, is similar. Now, you might say, well, there's a symmetry breaker here. This person is a finite being, and maybe they're influenced by outside sources, whereas God isn't. But what we want to say is that, look, just because God infinitely stretches into the past doesn't mean that there's a meaningful difference with respect to responsibility. The symmetry between the two cases is the following. The psychology could not have been otherwise with respect to what eventually motivated the action. In either case, it's the involuntariness that's doing the work, okay? And that's what we want to highlight, because the involuntariness is responsibility undermining. God's decision-making procedure is involuntary, and therefore he's not responsible. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is really interesting, because I think at the heart of this issue, it's like, can you be morally responsible for acting from a character that you didn't choose or you didn't have control over? I think it's related to some questions about luck, especially luck in our Constitution. So
I think that one thing to see that how the manipulation argument ties in with God is ask yourself, is there a difference between the manipulation argument and the instant creation case? Now, you might think that there's no difference in the sense that both people are not responsible for the psychology, or at least in the case of a perfect being, the psychology producing an act. And if there's no difference in those cases, it's a little hard to see how they differ from how instant creation differs from a case of a person who has this psychology essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And if someone has our psychology essentially, it's a little hard to see how that differs from God.
Mm-hmm.
So while I agree with Matt's point that this does seem to be a little bit different, there's no outside agent, I'm not sure how this affects the three similarity points, which is the person's not responsible for psychology, he's not responsible for authorizing his psychology, and he's not responsible for his psychology generating his act.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the distinction between praiseworthiness and blameworthiness, and some people might think that that's a significant distinction, like Susan Wolf, for instance, somebody like her. So perhaps this asymmetry could make it such that God could be praiseworthy and therefore morally responsible without it being possible for him to satisfy the conditions for blameworthiness. So what do you think about this objection?
Do you want to go ahead? Right. So in terms of the symmetry between praiseworthiness and blameworthiness, there are a few things here to note. So one is that we think that the praiseworthiness or blameworthiness maker, so just recall back to when we talked about the concepts, is essentially the same. So we think that responsibility is a basic feature, and it says positive or negative responsibility. So at least on our view, you're not going to get this hard asymmetry that you might, for instance, on Wolf's view. And then also we're going to say that this is a little bit of a counterintuitive position. I mean, it's a little bit strange to think that the same psychology could be either praiseworthy but not blameworthy, or blameworthy but not praiseworthy. And yeah, and then I think I'll pass the rest of that over to Steve.
Yeah, so two other responses. One is we think that a compelled praiseworthy act, a person's no more responsible for a compelled act which purports to be praiseworthy than he would be for a compelled act which purports to be blameworthy. Compulsion undermines responsibility, so it's going to undermine it whether it's positive or negative responsibility. In addition, there's nothing for which God could be praiseworthy. So the standard view is that God is going to be praiseworthy for creating the universe. So a couple things here. Number one, let's go over three possibilities. Either he creates the best possible world, he creates one of a number of worlds tied for the best possible world, or creates one in an infinite series of ever better worlds. Let's ask ourselves which of these three would make him praiseworthy. Well, if he creates the best possible world, number one, I doubt that's possible because I think he maxes out intrinsic goodness. But even if it's not the case, it looks like he's compelled to doing so. So we're back to the compulsion point. If he has to create a better world, but there's a bunch of tied worlds, worlds 1 through 1,000 are all tied for the maximum good one, and he arbitrarily chooses one of them, he's compelled to create one of them, but which one he creates, he does so freely. It's hard to see why that makes him praiseworthy. By analogy, if I'm compelled to give Nathan a box of Rice Krispies, but there's one of 1,000 different boxes from which I might give to him, you might think, well, the part over which I have freedom or control is which box to give him, but that's arbitrary. That's hardly something that makes me praiseworthy. And then third, if there's an infinite series of every better worlds, which is a fairly common view among the worlds in which God could create, it's arbitrary as to which one he create. And with regard to any world, he could have created a much, much better world. So it's a little hard to see what would make him praiseworthy given sort of the arbitrary selection of one of those worlds. So the idea is that if God's praiseworthy, he's praiseworthy for either doing something which is compelled or doing something arbitrary, but neither ground praiseworthiness.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to turn to ask a question about some of the implications of the argument. Suppose we accept the conclusion that God's not morally responsible, and so of course not blameworthy for anything, but then not praiseworthy either, even for things like creating the world. Most theists won't have any problem denying the no blameworthiness implication, but then the no praiseworthiness one looks pretty bad. Is it possible, though, to accept that God's not praiseworthy in the sense of moral responsibility that we've been talking about on the one hand, but then still to say that there's some sense in which God is praiseworthy, or putting it slightly differently, worthy of praise, that it's sort of fitting to respond in praise to God? I think I couldn't find the exact spot, but I think Peter Van Imwagen said at some point that there's a sort of praise that's directed to God that's like kind of cheering, applauding God, or celebrating maybe God's nature or God's actions, but it's not exactly the same kind of like, holding accountable or praiseworthiness in the sort of, you deserve this credit for having done this thing when you could have done something worse, that sense of moral responsibility that we've been talking about. So I'm just curious, do you all see it as a big problem for theists if they have to deny God's moral responsibility in the sense we've been talking about? Are there ways of accommodating God's praiseworthiness separately from that? What do y'all think are the implications?
So if I could pick up on one thread here. So at least as I understand the objection, the thought is, well, look, God might not have the full-bodied responsibility that might be deserving of praise, but he has like praise light, right? He has the basic subscription to praise, and so we can praise him at least a little bit. The problem here is what we have to think again, and so Graham Oppy's my advisor, so I'm very influenced by his thinking. We have to think, oh, look, what's the general theistic theory here? The general theistic theory is that God is uniquely worthy of worship. So if we're talking about praise, he like maxes out how praiseworthy an agent can possibly be. So notice, if the response to our argument is then to walk back how praiseworthy God is, now we're in tension with the general theistic picture, where the general theistic picture, at least according to the Anselmian tradition, is he's worthy of worship. And so worship just seems like praise maximized. And this is a veritable tradition. I mean, so like John Hick and Anselm and Adams talk about this. So for instance, Adams writes, creatures owe their being and well-being to God as their cause. So they owe their being and well-being to God in the sense of having an obligation to praise him by being the best beings they can, right? So there's this obligation to praise. There's this obligation to worship. And if we walk that back, big cost for the theist. And I think that raising the dialectical burden here is a sufficient response.
Yes, and I might add to that. Number one, you might think, again, which is kind of just an amplification of what Nathan's saying, that it requires a radical revision of theistic beliefs. If you think we should worship God but not be grateful to him, I mean, you could hold that. At the very least, you have to say, look, I'm radically revising the way in which believers think about God. But second, and this is kind of Nathan's earlier point, you might think there's an asymmetry here. If you think responsibility is important for human beings, but not for God, what would explain the asymmetry? So, for example, if you think that you need responsibility to explain why God can send some people to heaven and some people to hell, or why it's important, why the free will defense succeeds, or why the soul-making theodicy is correct. Okay, well, there's at least a significant difference. But why would we think, well, we should be responsibility theorists with regard to humans, but not with regard to God? Third, we also think that responsibility is a great-making feature. I mean, ask yourself, if you really had to choose between one of the two being gods, being God, one would be a essentially omnibenevolent but not responsible being. And the second would be a contingently benevolent but fully responsible being. Well, intuitively, I claim that the second being seems to be the greater of the two. Or at the very least, it's a tie. One of my intuitions, and I think Nathan's as well, are that the second is greater. So it does seem that responsibility is a great maker. It's an odd view that the greatest possible being is missing a great maker.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Okay, well...
Taylor, looks like you're holding back.
I know.
It seems like you have something on the tip of your tongue.
Yeah. Well, there's so many different directions to go. Yeah. Maybe I'll say this maybe this would be a nice way to end before going into the wrapping up section. So I guess one kind of lingering question that I have is, could it be, I think this is kind of inspired by the Van den Wagen line of thinking, if this is Van den Wagen's view, and I'm not really sure, but maybe it could make sense for us to have obligations to worship and praise and even express gratitude towards God, even if God doesn't deserve praise or isn't morally responsible in the sense that we've been talking about. Maybe this is a different sense of responsibility having to do with like recognizing good attributes of a character that's superior to our own, or maybe it's just being the beneficiary of benevolent acts. I just wonder if it's possible to ground even something like, Nathan, what you were talking about, like obligations to worship separately from the sense of responsibility that we've been talking about. I'm not sure that I'm attracted to that view, because I think, Stephen, what you've just been saying about responsibility being a great making property, I think sounds pretty attractive. Certainly freedom is, and I would think responsibility would go with it. So I'm not sure if I want to endorse this line of thought, but I do find something attractive in it.
Sure. So one thing to say here is that whatever type of responsibility is grounding this modified version of praiseworthiness is not the most, God wouldn't be like the most adequate conceivable object of praiseworthiness. There's a more adequate conceivable object of praiseworthiness, and this is someone who probably has a choice between alternatives and has a more robust sense of responsibility. Or would you agree with that, at least on this modified picture that you have?
I guess to make that possible, if y'all's argument is right, you'd have to have, I mean, this superior being that we're imagining would have to be able to do evil, or I don't know. It seems like there's a lot of imperfection that you'd have to blend in. And then I'm like, well, maybe that's not a superior being. I'm not sure.
Okay, good. Yeah. So, I mean, it just yeah. So that's good. So at least a little bit the idea here is that, I mean, if God is the most adequate object of worship, and this is something that John Hicks says, and there's no possibility of really any reality beyond him to which he is inferior or subordinate, and which thus there would be something like more worship worthy. And I think that what the point that Hick is driving at a little bit here, Matt, okay, a little bit of what the point that's driving here is that this might undermine theism, at least to a significant degree, because baked into the definition of God is that he's maximally deserving of worship, right? He's maximally deserving of worship. So if we then attenuate it at least a little bit and we say, well, look, like he's worship worthy in the same sense that, for instance, maybe we could worship a sunset, or we could be appreciative of someone that benefited us, at least to a certain degree, then we're lowering him at least to the status of maybe a human benefactor. or for instance, someone who gave us this incredible gift that we're very thankful for. But notice that that is sort of humanizing God in a way that theists might feel uncomfortable with, because they want to draw this very sharp distinction oftentimes between the human and the divine, where the divine is uniquely worthy of worship, and the humans, yes, they can benefit you, yes, they can do things that are praiseworthy, but it's distinct from what God does, and it's distinct in a meaningful sense. So if we blur that line, then that's going to not behoove theism, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
And if I could just quickly add to that, one is I'm not sure what would generate the obligation. I mean, if it's not an expression of gratitude, the notion that there is an obligation is really strange, because it's unclear to whom the obligation is owed. But in addition, the expression would be unfitting. I mean, to the degree that the expression does carry with it gratitude as at least part of the content, well, you simply shouldn't be grateful to someone who benefits you if they're not responsible for doing so. You might appreciate things like, you might appreciate your infant son, or you might appreciate the land that your family has held for generations, or you might appreciate your pet Komodo dragon. But it's not. But once you have attitudes that include a gratitude feature of it, it's not clear that you wrong anyone, and it's not clear these attitudes are bad, but they're unfitting. So I would claim that there's no obligation. In addition, they seem to be unfitting to the degree which they have a gratitude component.
Now I want a pet Komodo dragon. It's one of my favorite animals. Never thought about having one as a pet. Probably unsafe.
They're very quirky, so why not?
Yeah.
Well, thanks to both of you for joining us and for laying out this new and interesting argument. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
So yeah, they can find me on Nathan Bray and Phil Papers if they want to read my work. If they want to listen to more of the stuff that Steve and I do, we have a YouTube channel called The Repugnant Conclusion.
Nice.
And we host discussions sort of like these. And yeah, you could go check us out there.
Same thing. I mean, people can access my work in Phil Papers. I want to say it's been a real pleasure to appear with you guys. So we really appreciate you.
Likewise. Thank you.
It's been a wonderful opportunity, and you guys are top of the top when it comes to responsibility. So we appreciate it.
We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We just couldn't help it. Thanks again.
All right, anytime. All right, see you. Bye-bye.
In our next episode, we'll talk about divine luck, and our guest will be Andrei Leo Roosevelt.